Phenomenal. Why do you think our history, our legacy is always hidden somewhat? Whether it's about Oxford, Cordova, why is it always kept secret? And I already know, probably as being a scholar, when it comes to presenting documents, or probably when you had to get your doctorate and talking about the Moors, that people were probably somewhat scared about it, especially white professors, white doctors. So why, when it comes to our legacy and especially Moorish history, it's always kept hush hush?
It's a great question, brother. The reason, in my understanding after teaching now at the university and college level for some 3 decades,
Wow.
is that there is something that we can refer to as global Eurocentric hegemony, or so-called global white supremacy, right? In saying that, it doesn't mean that every person who's identified as or identifies with the term white is consciously, actively involved in trying to suppress African people in particular, or Asiatic people, from knowing who we are, right? But what I am saying is, this machine of perpetuation has been running for several centuries. It even speaks to why, for example, 500 years ago or 600 years ago, if one used the term Moor, there was no doubt that that term was referencing primarily people of African descent. But what you find over the course of centuries is that some people say, well, wait a minute, no, that term also was seen to reference people who were known to be Arabs, even people from India. Yes, but my point is, when you go back at the beginning, when the term Moor is being utilized, right, in the context of European history, in the context of dictionary definitions, that's one of the greatest sources anyone can use to understand what the perspectives were of people at a given point in time. Go to dictionaries from the 17th century. Go to dictionaries from the 16th century. See how the Dutch, see how the English, see how the Spanish, see how the people of Italy, although there was no Italy as we know it today, because it was various states, but go to the earliest sources to see how they defined folks. And it was clear that people who were Moors, who they referred to as Moors, were most assuredly either African or clearly dark complexioned non-Europeans connected to Asia, right? That's why I mentioned India, for example.
Right.
But the reason for hiding the information, think about this. Almost 800 years, African and quote unquote Middle Eastern people occupied the Iberian Peninsula. They didn't just influence the culture in terms of the sciences and worldview. They literally influenced the culture in terms of bloodlines. The infusion of African and Middle Eastern blood into the European populaces or populations in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, in Crete, and to some degree, I mean lesser, although there's a historian named Onyeka who recently wrote a book on the Tudors, the Black Tudors in England. And he talks about these African people that were coming into Britain, both from the period of the Romans right on up to the Tudor era. And Onyeka spends most of his time talking about the Tudors, which was one of the dynasties of the British crown, the British royal families or family. So the idea of telling the truth, putting something right out front, means that it's going to challenge the whole notion of ethnic identity or racial purity, as well as challenging the narrative of global white supremacy. Because what you're actually doing is saying, wait a minute, Western culture, the best of what's Western culture, is still an aggregate of taking the knowledge of people from Asia, Africa, and incorporating that into the European world. And then I dare say even incorporating the knowledge of the peoples of the Americas as well, right? Global white supremacy cannot allow for that, because what it's trying to do is sustain the misrepresentation of itself as inherently superior at all points in time.
Wow.
Once you start to uncover Europe's own history with its debt to the Moors, in this case, since this is our topic, right? What you're doing is saying, you all know, number one, that you got much, if not most of your seed money, so to speak, for this investment in intellectual and spiritual growth from non-European people. Just tell the truth. See, my thing is this, I'm not taking anything away from European advances, right? People advance, cultures advance, knowledge all the time. But at least acknowledge who taught you, who gave you the foundations to then advance and move forward. Because then what you have is a greater recognition of the cumulative efforts of the human family, right? The analogy that I use often, and even reference it in my book, Othello's Children in the New World, you know, in a baton race, right? You got 4 people on that track. If the last person running that baton across the track says, look at what I did all by myself, how are the other 3 baton runners going to feel, knowing that them running their leg of the track was completely ignored? And so much of what our educational system, when I say our, meaning within the Western world in general, but in particular in the United States, much of what that history has represented is an effort to ignore the other 3 runners on that track, right? And as a result, discussing the history of the Moors begins to cause an unraveling of the myth of inherent European supremacy, or so-called white, quote unquote, supremacy.